Welcome to Corn Silage Harvest Considerations, a podcast series by Cornell's PRODAIRY program and Cornell Cooperative Extension. In this podcast series, we're going to delve into the practical considerations for corn silage harvest. In this episode of our podcast series, we're going to be talking about the 2020 season for growing corn silage. I'm Kathy Barrett with the Cornell PRODAIRY program, and I have with me Joe Lawrence, who is our Forage Management Specialist with the PRODAIRY program, and Ron Kuck, who is the Dairy Educator for Cornell Cooperative Extension of Cayuga County. So welcome, gentlemen. We're going to jump right in to our recap of the season. So, it's been difficult to really reference a normal growing season anymore. So what are some of the key points for the 2020 season, and how does this compare to other recent seasons?
Thanks, Kathy. And we really have to recognize that we are dealing with more variable weather patterns these days. One thing that we do see as a more consistent trend is wetter falls. And for corn silage, that means more emphasis on early planting and tightening up our relative maturities in order to aim for an earlier harvest. To some extent, that's a piece of good news for 2020, providing we are geared up to take advantage of a relatively early corn harvest and the subsequent field activities like cover crops and manure application. While the spring was fairly cold, in general, it cooperated relatively well from a moisture standpoint and allowed for pretty timely planting in May. That was followed by above average heat accumulation through the season, resulting in what is lining up to be an early harvest for corn silage, hopefully helping us avoid some mud this fall.
Thanks, Joe. So going forward, what are some of the key things to look at for making sure you hit the optimum harvest window?
We certainly want to target whole plant dry matter to make harvest decisions, and we'll cover that in a future installments of this series. But for today, we want to stress that trying to make harvest decisions from visual cues could be especially problematic in a year like this. To put this season in perspective, in recent memory, I think it most closely mimics 2018 for a good share of New York. It's been on the drier side with spells of drought, but we generally had just enough rain just in time to keep things going. While yields may be down a bit, for the most part, the crop looks pretty healthy standing in the field and is progressing rapidly. So relying on those visual cues for this crop will most likely lead to chopping a very dry crop as the ear is maturing rapidly. And that really drives whole plant dry matter, even if the stalk still looks green and healthy.
Joe, you mentioned this is true for a good share of the state. Are there areas that this does not apply?
Yeah, definitely. There are some pockets where the drought conditions were more severe and persisted beyond tasseling. So in these cases, I'm reminded more of the 2016 growing season. In 2016, we saw where areas that saw drought relief come after tasseling or during the ear fill period seemed to try to play catch up with the ear development, and this prolonged the maturation process. So in these cases, the risk is the opposite. You want to make sure not to harvest too early, as that will result in a wet crop and an underdeveloped ear with lower starch, kind of adding insult to injury of an already stressed crop from the drought. So checking whole plant moisture, I'll just say that again, and making sure to wait to the right timing will pay dividends to get the best ear possible. In 2016, we saw when harvested at the right time, the overall yield was on the low side due to the drought, but a mature ear helped make up some of the loss. And finally, there are some reports of very severe drought continuing. This is more so in New England than in New York. In these cases where the crop has essentially stopped growing altogether, it may need to be harvested almost immediately to salvage whatever value there is and to try to get it at a dry matter that will allow it to ferment properly.
Mm-hmm. So what are some things to look for in the field as we prepare for harvest?
Well, it's definitely a good time to be assessing the growth stage and trying to estimate harvest timing. So really, whether it's in a notebook or on an actual map, mapping out your fields, recording things like estimated harvest date and crop productivity can be helpful. So again, whole plant dry matter should be used for the final harvest decision, but tracking growing degree days and looking at kernel progress can help approximate that timing and help you plan ahead. If you recorded tasseling dates, you can use 750 to 800 growing degree days from tasseling to estimate the early side of when the crop could be ready for silage harvest. We shouldn't be making harvest decisions based on kernel milk line, but it is still helpful to watch the progression of the kernel milk line, as it can give you an idea of harvest timing. And when we think about the crop productivity side of it, farms that have grown BMR are already in the habit of separating this feed from other corn silage to better optimize its use on the farm. But another time to consider this is when there are more extreme weather-induced challenges like we may have this year that could result in greater variability across the farm. So assessing fields now and noting fields that had an issue such as poor pollination or ear development is helpful in thinking about where and how to store the crop.
Let's elaborate on that. What are some considerations for storage as they relate to harvest planning? Ron, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so thanks, Kathy and Joe. So dairy farms, of course, you're looking to optimize the use of our homegrown forages, but we need to think about the quality of the forage and the right quality of the feed that goes towards the right group of animals that would benefit from that feed. So, but fortunately, dairy farms, you have lots of different groups of animals, and you can target different forages for different types of animals. But we sometimes, get stuck storing our best BMR, best processed corn silage. It gets buried under something that's not mature or of poor quality. And then when we need it, we can't feed it. So, and even if you don't have, the flexibility of storage, it's always a good exercise to be thinking about it for next year and learn from what happened this year and past years.
So if you don't have the space for 2020, what are some options to separate forages this year?
So if you grow all the same type of corn, say for silage, and your fields are fairly uniform, you got enough rain and things, might not be much of an issue. But if you have some fields or areas on your farm that are more variable because of the drought or later planting, you may want to consider, a short-term storage option. So of course, the obvious choice are ag bags. They work pretty well. You could put your stress forage in there, or forage that might not ferment very well, and that can be targeted for other than lactating cows. Temporary drive-over piles look like an easy thing to do because you don't need to, do anything but make a pile, right? But it comes with lots of pitfalls. So temporary drive-over piles, you find greater spoilage and waste, and also with that comes a lot of silage leachate issues. But if that's what you think you need to do, some of the choices that you need to make are find a solid surface where mud won't be an issue. Stay away from locations, again, where that leachate will drain towards standing or surface water. And one of the key things, and this goes for silos, bunk silos with sides also, create a pile or a ramp that you can pack from all sides. Not just from one side and have a cliff on the other. So a good ratio is a 3-to-1 run to rise ratio, no matter what kind of horizontal silo you're building. That creates good packing, and it's safe, and it makes a real nice tight pile. And of course, if you're a CAFO dairy, check with your nutrient management planner and designate a site for that temporary storage.
Great. This is all excellent information as we head into this corn silage harvest season. So I want to thank you, Ron, and thank you, Joe, for taking the time to talk with us. Thanks for listening to this episode of Corn Silage Harvest Considerations, presented by Cornell PRODAIRY Program and Cornell Cooperative Extension.